Welcome to Fear and Greed, the week ahead. I'm Sean Aylmer, and as always, I'm joined by economist Stephen Koukoulas, a very excited economist, I suspect. You'll find him at thekouk.com, thekouk.com, and on Twitter using the handle thekouk. Stephen, how was last week for you?
Oh, it was exciting. It was incredible to see, well, a whole range of things, because we saw the Reserve Bank come to the party with a 25 basis point rate hike. We saw the Fed hiking interest rates, the Bank of England hiking interest rates, that incredible volatility in stock and bond markets through the course of the week. So, gosh, you look away for 5 minutes and the world's changed, basically.
Yeah. So let's start with the Reserve Bank. Is it embarrassing for the bank, do you think, to sort of have to eat their words, really, and basically hike rates almost 2 years before they said they were going to 6 months ago?
Yeah, and indeed, even if you look at the April minutes of the RBA board meeting, they said, rates are on hold for an extended period of time, and there they were 4 weeks later hiking them. So, look, it's easy to be critical of the RBA, so I will be. They've made mistakes. They've got it wrong. They ignored the wage pressures. Then all of a sudden, they're listening to anecdotes of wage pressures. They ignored the inflation acceleration. Now they're looking at it. They ignored the rate hikes from other central banks. Now they're following that lead. So in a sense, they've got a bit of catch up to do. And I think there's some damaged credibility. But to their benefit, I suppose, they have learnt from those mistakes. So the 25-point hike was probably a bit more than people were thinking. And certainly the hawkishness that Governor Lowe was exuding because he gave the press conference after the rate hike last Tuesday. So there were a lot of journalists, people from financial markets grilling him on what was going on. And I must confess that he came across really well in that interview, and he perhaps was doing that mea culpa about, we misread the inflation pickup. Yes, we've misread the wages pickup, and yet we need to get on our bikes and start hiking if we're to get inflation back under control.
Yeah, I mean, when you say hawkish, it's kind of this bias towards lifting rates. It certainly is very, very different how he sounded a week ago, last Tuesday, after lifting rates, than any time in the last few years.
Oh, indeed. And I think that's pragmatism. I think it's coming through. I think that the harsh reality of the numbers now. And he did allude to as well that he wants to see inflation remaining accelerated before he moves again. He wants to see that wages numbers picking up. So in a sense, he's looking at the rearview mirror, adjusting policy, which doesn't take effect for another 6 to 12 months. So I recall Glenn Stevens, when he was governor, certainly Ian Macfarlane, they preemptively adjusted monetary policy. Now, they didn't always get it right, but if they didn't, they would reverse that policy action. Whereas Dr. Lowe seems to be one that looks at the numbers, waits for the numbers to come through. Although, as we saw last week, perhaps it's a bit more of a looking ahead and realising that with their forecast of inflation hitting 6%, underlying inflation getting above 4.5%, that we know that there's got to be a lot of more rate hikes to come in before they get inflation down.
And as you mentioned, the US Federal Reserve and Bank of England hiked rates last week. Markets went up and then they really went down. The Bank of England commentary was really interesting because the war in Ukraine, energy prices, has really cast a shadow over growth in the UK, it seems. The Bank of England was actually quite downbeat.
It was an interesting one. And I guess this is going to be the dilemma that all economists, all central banks are going to be looking at over the months ahead, not just the weeks ahead, but certainly the months ahead. Do we have this, dare I say it, stagflation, where you get really high inflation with really weak growth, that whatever the central banks do to try to contain inflation really hits financial markets and the real economy really, really hard? So do we get the scenario, say, at the end of this year where, inflation, around the world in most countries is sort of 4 or 5%, but GDP's at, 1% and unemployment's starting to creep up again? That's what I think is feeding into the commentary and the analysis now. Can we get away with more rate hikes without actually hitting the economy really hard?
It was quite the week last week, Stephen, a little quieter in the next few days.
Yeah, not really headline-grabbing news, although it's all important in its own way. One of the things that I think I'll be looking at, and most of my colleagues in the markets will be looking at, is the NAB Business Confidence Survey. This will incorporate a lot of that inflation news, that the cost and price pressures coming through, both in input costs to the business sector that the NAB will be reporting on. They'll also be reporting on expected selling prices. So are businesses passing on all these extra costs that they're seeing? And really importantly, the bit that I love most about the NAB survey at the moment is there's a question on labour costs, so wages in other words, and that last survey hit a record high, that the number of firms saying that they're going to be increasing their wages payments, so the wages bill of running their business, was at a record high for the survey. If that increases again, then I think we can be absolutely sure that it's only a matter of time before the official data show that pickup in wages.
Okay, I mean, payroll and wages data is all the go for the next 6 weeks. I mean, can you imagine what happens when official data comes out and it's not rising? What does the Reserve Bank do then?
Well, that would be a dilemma, and there's some probability that does happen. But thankfully, later this week, we also see the ABS measure of payrolls and wages growth. It's sort of like an aggregate wage number. So it's not an individual worker wages, so how much you and I are getting each week, but it's the aggregate cost to business of their wages bill. So it incorporates the number of people that are being employed, the number of hours worked, and also the increase in wages. So in a sense, it's going to be a slightly more difficult number to read, but we know over the last few months that number's been picking up, again, as tentative evidence that the wages side of the economy is also picking up.
Great time to be an economist, Stephen. I mean, I don't want to be disrespectful to all those economists out there, including you, but there are times when not much happens. This is not one of those times.
It's certainly not one of those times. And, and when the central banks are on hold for 6 and 12 months, when inflation's comfortably within the target range, we're at sort of close to full employment. Budget policy's pretty boring. You've got to make up a bit of a story actually to justify your views.
Oh, Stephen, you would never make it up, would you?
No, not really, but you then look for something that's a bit more interesting to people. So that's where the house prices become important, or the cost of running a business, these sorts of things. But at the moment, there's no lack of information, and every person I'm talking to has got a particular issue, be it with the cost of running their business, the skill shortage that's evident, the rate hikes, these sorts of things. Yeah. So there's a lot of issues for both investors and business owners. It's a really hot time.
Stephen, have a great week.
Thank you, Sean.
That was economist Stephen Koukoulas, better known as The Kouk. You can find him at thekouk.com and follow him on Twitter using the handle The Kouk. Definitely follow Stephen on Twitter. He was very entertaining last week, so do that. I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed, the week ahead.